Hello, I'm Dickie Arbiter in London.
And I'm Victoria Arbiter in New York, and you're watching Royal Report. When we first launched Royal Report late last August, we said we planned to concentrate on the senior working members of the British royal family. They continue to be our primary focus, but on occasion, issues affecting non-working members have an impact on those holding down the fort. As calls for the King to strip the Duke and Duchess of Sussex of their royal titles increasingly gain momentum, we thought it might be helpful to present an explainer on why the chances of him doing so are slim to none. While I don't believe the King has any interest in stripping Harry and Meghan, he never presumed to take away a gift bestowed by his mother, the late Queen. Some may be surprised to learn he simply doesn't have the power. Now, Dad, I know that we like to avoid hypothetical worlds because they are redundant, but if you will humour me a little bit, we are going to enter the world of the hypothetical. And let's just say that the King did want to strip Harry and Meghan. Anyone from the Daily Mail that's watching, he does not. That is not what I am saying. But let's say he did. He couldn't do it. Why is that?
The King cannot strip the Duke and Duchess of Sussex of their dukedom. It was bestowed upon them by his mother, the late Queen, but only Parliament. I'm going to repeat that. Only the British Parliament can remove those titles. They can only remove those titles by first debating it in the lower house, in the House of Commons. It would then have to go to the upper house, the House of Lords, who would then make amendments or say whatever, because they have a knack of mucking about with all sorts of bills that get up there. They're not elected members, but they like to play around a bit. It would then go back to the House of Commons, and it might get through. But at the moment, the British Parliament has got a lot on its plate, as every parliament has throughout the world. There is an economic crisis. We're trying to get through it. There are all sorts of issues here in the United Kingdom. We have a migration issue. We have an economic issue. We have a housing issue. We have a national health issue. I'm not going to go on anymore. The country has an issue. So they're not going to debate it. But if they did decide to debate it, and if it did pass through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and their titles of Sussex were stripped, what would they be called? Well, Harry, who is a prince of the United Kingdom, would refer to and revert to his original name, Prince Henry of Wales, and Meghan would be Princess Henry of Wales. No, not Princess Meghan, Princess Henry of Wales. That is the legal name that she would have. But we already have Princess Michael of Kent, but sometimes she's called Marie Christine. She's never called Princess Marie Christine. She's always called Princess Michael of Kent. But with the Sussexes living in the States, the handle would probably be Princess Meghan and Prince Harry. Prince Harry will always be Prince Harry. Formally, he is Prince Henry, but he is Prince Harry. Meghan would be called Princess Meghan, but there's no chance of that Sussex title being removed. So what do? We move on.
We move on. You would think, and I wish we could move on, because given everything that is affecting the world right now, this is just a non-entity. It doesn't matter. I think what people perhaps don't understand is that Duke and Duchess of Sussex are to them what Mr. and Mrs. Smith might be to somebody else. You know, there are a lot of women today that are staunch feminists that are choosing to keep their own name, and frankly, they can. I kept my own name when I got married in a work environment. That is becoming more of a thing. But in the royal family, royal women assume the titles of their husband, hence Meghan being the Duchess of Sussex because her husband is the Duke of Sussex. And as you quite rightly point out, Dad, They are never going to be plain old Mr. and Mrs. Because Harry is a blood-born prince. So we're going to get into a bill that a British MP is trying to push through. Again, an almighty waste of time. But we're going to get to that in a moment. But I thought it would be just really helpful to give a bit of background on the Dukedom of Sussex. Now, ahead of Harry and Meghan's wedding in 2018, the Queen opted to confer a dukedom on her grandson, Prince Harry, thereby creating him the Duke of Sussex. By extension, Meghan became the Duchess of Sussex. Prior to the wedding, there were a few other dukedoms up for consideration. There was Clarence, Connaught, Kendal, Ross, Windsor, but Sussex was considered the most appropriate. And I really like that the Queen clearly put so much thought into it, because what some people may not know is that the first and only former Duke of Sussex, Prince Augustus, campaigned for the abolition of slavery. He married twice, but both of his marriages, they were for love, but they contravened the Royal Marriages Act. And so as such, neither of his wives were allowed to assume the title of the Duchess of Sussex, which means the one-time Meghan Markle is the first and perhaps will be the only Duchess of Sussex. There's a lot of symbolism associated with the title. So before we get into more of the nitty-gritty and what this MP is trying to do, Dad, I think we should talk to the fact that the Queen did clearly put a lot of thought into this, that royal titles are not just plucked out of the air and it's like, you get to be Baron von blah blah. There's symbolism associated to them. The Dukedom of Sussex came without any controversy attached to it. And I think that the Queen recognised there was an opportunity there for Meghan to make it her own. She was the first and thus far only, potentially may always be the only. So could you talk a little bit, having been behind palace walls, sort of how these titles are chosen? Cambridge was obviously given to the Prince and Princess of Wales when they first married. How does it all come about?
It's a decision that's taken by the Queen, and she quite rightly, as you say, looked into the origins of Sussex. I want to go back to somebody else at the moment. We've got the Duke of York, and we've got Sarah, Duchess of York, because they're divorced. Where does the Dukedom of York come from? Well, traditionally, the second son of the sovereign is a Duke of York. George V, who did become Prince of Wales, he was the Duke of York because he was Edward VII's second son. His first son died of pneumonia. So George V became Duke of York. His second son, who eventually became George VI, was Duke of York. His eldest son was the Prince of Wales, and when he abdicated, he became the Duke of Windsor. Sounds a bit confusing, a bit convoluted, but it's always traditionally the second son is the Duke of York. The Queen very carefully chooses what sort of name, what sort of dukedom. Cambridge was always going to be short term because ultimately, yes, she was going to pass, and she did in 2022, and William was going to become Prince of Wales. And then we had Edward, who was created Earl of Wessex when he married Sophie in 1999 at St George's Chapel, Windsor. But that was always going to be short term because in the back of the Queen's mind was the thought that one day he would be created the Duke of Edinburgh when she had gone and when her husband had gone, the Duke of Edinburgh. And it was quite a while, well, not such a while, it was on Edward's 59th birthday that he was given the title Duke of Edinburgh. It was something that his mother and father wished him to have. It was something that the King, as Prince of Wales, agreed for him to have. There was a lot of talk in the British media that Charles wasn't going to give it to him, which was absolute nonsense. It was there for him. But the royals tend to do things on a special occasion. I thought, and I had said at the time, that I thought it would be on his 60th birthday, but it wasn't. It was actually on his 59th birthday. But he is Duke of Edinburgh. The title doesn't go to his son. It goes back to the sovereign, and then the sovereign decides where it goes or whether it stays in abeyance or not. But Harry and Meghan, they have this dukedom, and they should enjoy it, but not use it. Because they are not working royals. And when I say not use it to further their aims of what they're doing on the work front. People know who they are, Harry and Meghan. You don't need a handle to promote yourself. You promote yourself through your talent, not because you happen to have a title, whether it is Sir, whether it is Lord, whether it is Earl or Duke or whatever. And so far, they seem to have done well, but it seems to be wobbling a little bit. And I think they need to pull back and decide what it is they want to do, not use their title, use their talent. That is what is important.
Speaking of talent, Dad, I just want to take a moment because as your daughter, I can. But I want to give you a shout out because shortly before Edward was made the Duke of Edinburgh, there had been all kinds of random articles in the newspapers saying that the king had gone against the wishes of his late mother and father, that he wasn't going to give the dukedom to Edward, and that Princess Charlotte was apparently going to get the title, which, given she's just a little girl, seemed a tad unusual. You were the only one, and I think it really speaks to your expertise and your tremendous knowledge. And I don't want to make you blush, but you were right, and you were proven right. And yes, you did say that you thought Edward might get it on his 60th birthday. Perhaps the king decided to do a little bit earlier just to hush all the noise and the speculation so that people would move on to something more important. But for the record, once again, you were right, so I salute you. But going back to the Dukedom of Sussex, is Sussex a hereditary title? Is it a title that Prince Archie, Harry and Meghan's little boy, will inherit one day?
I don't think anybody knows that because nothing has been made public. My guess is that it probably will be a hereditary title. Once the title has been given, it becomes hereditary. It depends what level you are. I mean, Prince Philip's title reverted to the crown, and unless provision is made that it reverts to the crown when it is next used, it will be inherited. Now, provision was made that when Edward dies, it will revert to the crown, that his son does not inherit the title. The king might have other ideas as James gets older. William might have ideas because Charles might not be around and Edward will be. That remains to be seen. But as we stand at the moment, it reverts to the crown. There is no suggestion that the Sussex title should revert to the crown. So the possibility is that when Harry dies, which is a long time hence because he's still a young man, that Archie will get the title.
This is just another example, though, of where things related to the Sussexes are actually quite complicated because we're in uncharted territory. Harry is the second son of the current reigning British monarch. And if he and Meghan had chosen to remain working members of the royal family, they were very much supposed to be a part of the king's slimmed down monarchy. I don't think the issue of whether or not Archie would inherit that title would be an issue at all. It's not something anyone would be discussing because he would eventually probably be a working member of the royal family too. But this is where we're in uncharted territory with the Sussexes, and there are so many variables and elements that are kind of a hurry up and wait and see. We don't know how they're going to unfold, and without information being made public, this is why speculation tends to run rampant. But I think certainly for now, Harry remains the Duke of Sussex. He's never going to be Mr. Sussex. And whether or not Archie becomes the Duke of Sussex one day, well, that remains to be seen.
I think it does remain to be seen, and my guess is because Harry is so far down the succession chain that Archie will become the Duke of Sussex. Where it does change slightly is you've got Andrew, Duke of York. Now, if he'd had a son, the son would not have inherited that title because the Dukedom of York is traditionally held by the second son of the sovereign. So that when William comes to the throne, it's conceivable by the time he comes to the throne and by the time Prince Louis, is old enough, his uncle Andrew might have gone on to pastors new and he will inherit the title, the Duke of York. That's all crystal ball gazing in the future. But just a point to make, the York dukedom is in the gift of the sovereign to the second son.
But Dad, that's a really interesting point now because historically, certainly in recent years, King George VI, King George V, as you mentioned, were both previously Duke of York, both enormously well respected. Some might say that Prince Andrew has rather tarnished the title. So would William want that title going to his son Louis? It may be in the fullness of time and enough generations have gone past that people didn't remember that. But I think I'd love to come back to this point in maybe 30 or 40 years, if you could stick around, so we can just see whether or not William's decided if Louis should take on that title. And this is why the history and the precedent and the traditions surrounding members of the royal family are eternally fascinating, because you just don't know. Dad, I do want to get to this MP's point, just to make sure that I'm getting it all correct. I am going to read it. So in the wake of the Sussexes documentary for Netflix, Prince Harry's book Spare, various articles for magazines, podcasts, so many commercial endeavours, this is where these calls to strip the Sussexes of their titles have come from. People have thought that what they've done has not been right. They don't like that they have slated members of the British royal family, if I may be diplomatic. There's a lot of controversy, a lot of scandal, which we do not need to get into now. It has been discussed ad nauseum, but that's where these calls for the Sussexes to be stripped of their titles have originated. Now, Bob Seeley, who is an MP for the Isle of Wight, in December, he outlined his hopes to bring forward legislation in the House of Commons, as he discussed, in a bid to do just that, to remove the titles. He's calling it the Titles Deprivation 1917 Act Amendment Bill. It is a private member's bill. It was presented to Parliament on December 11th. The second reading has been scheduled to take place on June 14th. He said he's not a Republican. He does support the monarchy, but he said after the couple's latest instalment of their feud with the rest of the royal family, he thinks that Parliament and the Privy Council should consider the nuclear option. That is intense language. He said the Duke and Duchess can be Mr. and Mrs. like the rest of us. Well, that is where he is wrong, because as we've just discussed, Harry is a blood-born prince. He's the king's son. He's never going to be a Mr. If the bill passed, it would amend the legislation that stripped royal titles from two minor royals who supported Germany in the First World War. I think that's an extreme example, likening Harry and Meghan to two minor royals that supported Germany during the First World War. But as you rightly pointed out as well, does the House of Parliament not have bigger issues to deal with? How do we get people to move on from this idea? Because as we have stated, you repeated it twice, the king does not have the power. How do we move on from this?
Well, they're going to have to move on, because this year there's going to be a general election. So that bill is not going to go anywhere in June, because politicians are going to be deliberating over when Parliament is going to be prorogued. If it has already been prorogued, they're going to be on the election trail. And once Parliament is prorogued, nothing happens. The MPs that are sitting no longer sit as MPs and are no longer MPs. So I don't think the bill is going to go anywhere. He might try again at a later stage, if indeed he is elected again at the next general election. But I think people have got to move on. The title is there. It doesn't really mean anything in the States. Yeah, Americans like the idea of a title, but he's not a working royal. So let's move on. Leave them to what they're doing. Let's move on and get on with our own lives, because it ain't going to happen here.
There are very few people in the world, famous people, that can be known by one name. So off the top of my head, Oprah, Madonna, Rihanna, there are a few people you can say just their name and you know exactly who
Harry
they're
and
talking about.
Meghan, they're known by one name.
My point exactly. And so I think that's perhaps where we can move on from this conversation as well, because you say Harry and Meghan, a bit like Posh and Bex, everybody knows exactly who you are talking about. So one example, you may remember it was a few years ago that the Princess of Wales, she read a bedtime story on Jack and Nori, which for anyone watching who may be international who doesn't know, Jack and Nori is a very famous children's television show where over the years, gosh, for many, many years, celebrities and actors, singers, you name it, they've read bedtime stories to children. And the Princess of Wales did that, and she introduced herself ahead of the story as Catherine. I don't know, but time frames are off, but around a similar time frame. The Duchess of Sussex was in New York to read a copy of her children's book, The Bench, to school children at a low-income school, and she introduced herself as the Duchess of Sussex. Now, this might be one way of combating this constant dialogue, which just furthers these negative narratives, where that would have been an instance where if she'd have introduced herself as Meghan, everyone would have known who she was. The book would have got ample publicity. She wouldn't have been criticised for cashing in on her royal title, and the commercialization of the royal title wouldn't necessarily be a factor. So, as you say, Dad, maybe that's the way forward. Maybe it becomes Harry and Meghan.
You know, as you rightly said, everybody knows who Oprah is, everybody knows Posh and Becks, everybody knows Harry and Meghan. Just leave it at that. You don't need a title.
Now, along with the title controversy, some people are suggesting that if you were to strip them of their royal titles, that somehow that suddenly removes them from the line of succession as well. And this is where these problems really become massive, in my view, is the misinformation, the disinformation that's getting peddled simply because people might not like them or people are responding to certain actions that they might have done. So let's clarify this once and for all. So, Dad, repeating once again that the king does not have the power to remove their titles. What happens with succession?
The king does not have the power to remove the titles, only Parliament. Let's put that one to bed. As far as succession is concerned, Harry still remains fifth in line to the throne. There is William, George, Charlotte, Louis, then Harry. If the worst happens and the whole lot are wiped out, Harry succeeds. You cannot remove the line of succession. He does stay at number 5.
Dad, I think too, let's put this in human terms as well, because something you've said to me in the past when we've sort of rolled our eyes at this ongoing conversation is that the late Queen bestowed that title. That was her gift. And as we alluded to at the beginning, the king would never presume to remove that. But we're also talking about a father and a son. And one word you've said before is that the king would never be so vindictive. It would be antagonistic to do that. At this point where the relationship is still so incredibly fragile, that seems even more important to preserve the last vestiges of the relationship that are there right now anyway.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the king is more intent on repairing the relationship with his son than thinking about, well, let's get rid of that title. That title's never going to go. Let's be perfectly honest. It's going to stay. It was given by the late Queen, by Harry's grandmother, and it's going to stay there. And eventually it will pass down to Archie in so many years hence when Harry is no longer here. The king is not going to remove it. And I think we've just got to accept that the title stays. I mean, if somebody is Mr. and Mrs. and they do something wrong, do they say you've got to get rid of Mr. and Mrs.? No, of course they don't. You just carry on as Mr. and Mrs. Harry and Meghan are Duke and Duchess of Sussex, end of.
You're right. I mean, I hereby strip you of your mister. I mean, when you put it like that, it's utterly ridiculous, isn't it? Yes, well, like it or not, depending on which camp you're in, one day Catherine, the wife of the Prince of Wales, will be Queen Consort. As the wife of the reigning king, she'll be known as Queen Catherine, in a similar fashion to Queen Camilla as the wife of King Charles. Meghan, well, she'll be assigned her place in the history books as the first and the only Duchess of Sussex. Whether or not she continues to be only Duchess of Sussex, well, that's a topic for future historians to debate many, many moons from now. But as far as we're concerned, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex will remain the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, no matter how loud the calls to strip their titles become. That's it for another edition of Royal Report. Please be sure to share your comments in the section below. We always love hearing from you. And also make sure to click like and subscribe so you never miss a future episode. We look forward to seeing you next time on Royal Report.